I'm writing a book about a British author who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and yet almost nothing has been written about him as an author. He's perhaps the most famous unknown author of the 20th century, Winston S. Churchill. You may have heard of him. Winston Churchill, of course, is universally known as Britain's great war leader in 1940. His career, in a sense, in hindsight, seems predestined to lead up to this great moment. In his war memoirs, he wrote about the way he'd become Prime Minister at that juncture, and he said, "I felt as though all my past life I'd been walking with destiny, and that my career had led up to this moment, to this challenge and to this hour." And that's true. If one looks at his political career, he'd been out of office in British politics, his wilderness years during the 1930s. This meant that he had clean hands when he came into government to deal with the enormous problem of Hitler and Nazi Germany. But he had another career, you know, a career as a writer. And it was in the 1930s also that he ended up writing a history of the English-speaking peoples. And I think that's a story too that needs to be explored more fully. Why did he do it? How did he do it? And what is the general impact of his work, specifically as a writer here? It wasn't until 1956 that Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples began to be published. It was then published in 4 volumes on both sides of the Atlantic. It had an enormous acclaim, an enormous readership. It made Churchill an enormous amount of money. And looking back on it, it seems obvious that Winston Churchill would be writing about the English-speaking peoples. But the contract for that book had been drawn up many, many years before. It was, in fact, in 1931 that he signed this contract, agreed it with his publishers. I wanted to find out why he actually chose this particular subject. And when I looked at this, I found, to my surprise, that before 1931, he wasn't actually particularly interested in the English-speaking peoples. It was a topic that he'd largely ignored. That the concept of the English-speaking peoples had come out of an entirely different political context in the late 19th century, going back, in fact, to British responses to the American Civil War. It was a concept that came into politics from the left, but Churchill was a man who came into politics from the right. It's thus, in a sense, no surprise that he had no earlier encounter with the concept that he later made so famous and that became the core of one of his great writing enterprises too. There's one central point that we have to understand about Churchill as a writer. He never made any bones about it himself, that he wrote for money. He liked to quote Dr. Samuel Johnson, "No man, sir, but a blockhead ever wrote except for money. It was always," he said, "by my pen and by my tongue that I've made my living." I've looked at Churchill's tax receipts for the 1930s in particular. At that time, a British MP was paid just a few £100s a year. That was about 3% of Churchill's total income. Where did the rest come from? From his other career as a writer. And if we follow the money, as they say, we're more likely to understand why Churchill began with his last big project, his History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Once Churchill picked up the idea of the English-speaking peoples and their unity, it was an idea with legs. He gave it legs partly through his own wartime oratory, obviously serving Britain's need to enlist the Americans behind the British war effort. Churchill made a great speech at Fulton, Missouri in 1946, where he talked about an Iron Curtain descending on Europe. But the new idea in that speech was actually that of a special relationship between Britain and the United States, which should guide their policy in the post-war period. And although this idea evoked more enthusiasm and credibility in Britain than it did in Washington, it was an idea that marched on through the rest of the 20th century, right down to the era of George W. Bush and Tony Blair.